Deep in the hollers of Appalachia, where ancient mountains hold secrets darker than the coal buried beneath them, there are stories that most people will never hear. If you're ready to uncover the twisted history and disturbing mysteries hidden in these hills, smash that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell, because the content we explore on this channel isn't for the faint of heart. Welcome to Boring Nightmares, where we dive into the shadows of Appalachian folklore, true crime, and the strange phenomena that mainstream media won't touch. Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachia, where cell towers still can't reach and GPS systems mysteriously fail, certain family names have been whispered like warnings for over 2 centuries. These aren't the feuding clans you've heard about in history books. These are bloodlines that made bargains with forces far older and darker than any mountain feud. In 1952, a federal investigator wrote in his classified report before disappearing without a trace. What these families practice goes beyond folk magic or primitive superstition. The 5 families I'm about to reveal didn't just survive in America's most isolated wilderness. They thrived through generations of poverty, disease, and isolation that destroyed other settlements. But their prosperity came at a cost that still echoes through these ancient mountains today. Local historians refuse to speak their names aloud. Law enforcement agencies have sealed records dating back to the 1800s. And those few descendants who remain have scattered to the furthest corners of the country, carrying secrets they pray will die with them. What you're about to learn has been deliberately buried, hidden in unmarked graves and burned documents, whispered only in the darkest corners of Appalachian memory. These are the true stories of families who discovered that in the oldest mountains of America, help always comes with a price, and some debts are paid in blood for generations. The first family settled in these mountains in 1831, fleeing accusations of witchcraft in Massachusetts. They called themselves the Blackwoods, and they brought with them practices that would make the Salem witch trials look like child's play. Martha Blackwood, the family matriarch, claimed she could hear the mountains themselves speaking to her. She taught her children that the ancient peaks held consciousness, a sleeping awareness that could be awakened through the right offerings, the right words, the right sacrifices. By 1840, the Blackwood settlement in what locals called Shadow Creek Valley had grown to include over 30 family members living in a cluster of cabins built in a very specific pattern. From above, their homes formed a perfect circle around a natural clearing where 13 white pine trees grew in an unnaturally straight line. At the center of this grove stood a stone table, its surface worn smooth by generations of use, stained dark with substances that never quite washed away in the mountain rains. The Blackwoods practiced what they called the binding, a monthly ritual performed under the dark moon when the mountains were said to be most receptive to human communication. Family members would gather in concentric circles around their stone altar, with the eldest conducting a ceremony that combined elements of European witchcraft with something far more ancient, something that seemed to emerge from the mountains themselves. Those brave enough to spy on these gatherings from the surrounding forest described scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The Blackwoods would stand in perfect silence as their elder made precise cuts on willing participants, collecting their blood in a bowl carved from mountain laurel wood. But this wasn't simple blood magic. The family believed that by mixing their blood with water from specific mountain springs, soil from their ancestral graves, and herbs that grew only in the deepest shadows of their valley, they could create a connection not just to each other, but to the mountains themselves. This supernatural bond allegedly granted them abilities that neighbors noticed but never dared to discuss openly. The Blackwoods lived far longer than anyone else in the region, with several family members reportedly reaching ages well over 100 despite the harsh mountain conditions. They seemed to sense danger before it arrived, always knowing when revenue agents or curious outsiders were approaching their territory. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to influence the thoughts and actions of those who drank from streams that flowed through their land. Local records from the 1860s document a disturbing pattern. Travelers who camped near Blackwood territory often reported vivid dreams of being watched by shadowy figures who whispered in languages they couldn't understand. Some visitors claimed they woke up with small cuts on their arms or legs that they couldn't remember receiving. Others described feeling compelled to leave personal items behind, as if the mountains themselves were demanding tribute. The Blackwood influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through what they called their water network. They had mapped every spring, stream, and creek that flowed from their mountain, and they knew that their ritual offerings would eventually reach settlements dozens of miles away. Family journals discovered years later contained detailed records of how their ceremonies affected downstream communities, noting changes in behavior, health, and even birth rates in towns that had no idea they were connected to the Blackwood practices. The family's power grew throughout the Civil War years, as desperate soldiers and civilians sought their help for everything from healing wounds to finding missing loved ones. The Blackwoods never refused a request, but they always demanded payment that seemed insignificant at first. A lock of hair, a treasured photograph, a few drops of blood mixed with their mountain spring water. What visitors didn't realize was that these offerings bound them to the family's network, making them susceptible to influence and ensuring their eventual return. By 1880, the Blackwood bloodline had spread throughout 3 counties, not through migration, but through what they called the seeding. Family members would travel to isolated communities, marry into local families, and gradually introduce their practices to their new relatives. They were careful to maintain the appearance of normal mountain folk, but they always established their ritual sites, always found their mountain springs, always created their connections to the greater network. The Blackwood children were raised from birth to understand their family's true nature. They learned to read the signs in rock formations, to identify the plants that held power, to hear the whispers that came from deep within the earth. By adolescence, most possessed abilities that would have been called supernatural by outsiders. They could find water in the driest conditions, predict weather changes days in advance, and communicate with each other across vast distances through methods that seemed to bypass normal human senses. But the family's most closely guarded secret was their relationship with what they called the deep dwellers, entities that they claimed lived in the hollow spaces beneath the mountains. The Blackwoods believed these beings were the original inhabitants of the region, ancient consciousnesses that had retreated underground when the first humans arrived. Through their blood rituals and mountain offerings, the family had established a covenant with these entities, trading human energy and occasional sacrifices for protection and supernatural abilities. The evidence of this relationship was found in the extensive cave systems beneath Blackwood territory. When authorities finally investigated the area in 1917, they discovered tunnels that had been modified with human hands, chambers carved with symbols that matched no known language, and altars where the rock itself seemed to have been shaped by something other than conventional tools. Most disturbing were the bones, both human and animal, arranged in patterns that suggested complex ceremonial purposes. The investigation began after a series of disappearances that could no longer be ignored. Between 1910 and 1917, at least 12 people had vanished while traveling through or near Blackwood territory. Unlike typical missing persons cases, these disappearances shared unusual characteristics. The victims were always alone, always traveling at night, and always found to have some personal connection to the extended Blackwood family network, even if they weren't aware of it themselves. When federal marshals finally arrived at Shadow Creek Valley in the spring of 1917, they found the settlement completely abandoned. The cabin stood empty but undisturbed, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air. The stone table remained in its clearing, but the 13 white pines had been cut down and arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed to point toward a previously unknown cave entrance. Most mysteriously, every grave in the family cemetery had been carefully excavated, not by grave robbers, but apparently by the families themselves, as if they had taken their ancestors with them when they fled. The cave system revealed the true scope of the Blackwood operations. Tunnels extended for miles beneath the mountain, connecting to natural springs, hidden chambers, and what appeared to be underground ritual sites. The walls were covered with carved symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the light. In the deepest chamber, investigators found a pool of water that reflected no light whatsoever, surrounded by offerings that included jewelry, weapons, and preserved human organs arranged in careful patterns. Local tradition holds that the Blackwoods didn't truly disappear, but instead retreated permanently into their underground network, continuing their practices in the deep places where no outside authority could reach them. Even today, hikers in the area report hearing sounds that seem to come from beneath their feet, rhythmic chanting, the echo of footsteps in empty tunnels, and sometimes voices calling their names from cave openings that appear to have no bottom. Modern investigators have attempted to map the full extent of the Blackwood cave system, but their efforts have been consistently frustrated by equipment failures, sudden weather changes, and the unsettling tendency for team members to become separated and lost even in familiar territory. Several exploration attempts have been abandoned after researchers reported feeling watched by unseen presences and hearing sounds that seemed designed to lead them deeper into the mountain rather than back to the surface. The Blackwood legacy lives on in the bloodlines they seeded throughout Appalachia. Genealogical research has identified dozens of families with Blackwood ancestry, though most are unaware of their connection to the Shadow Creek settlement. However, certain patterns persist across generations. An unusual affinity for mountain wilderness, the ability to find water and navigate by instinct, and a tendency toward what locals call the sight, an uncanny awareness of events happening beyond normal perception. Perhaps most significantly, many descendants report dreams of underground chambers, flowing water, and voices speaking in languages they don't recognize but somehow understand. These dreams often begin in childhood and grow more vivid with age, sometimes culminating in an irresistible urge to visit specific mountain locations where they experience what they describe as a sense of coming home, even though they've never been to these places before. The Blackwood story represents just one thread in the dark tapestry of Appalachian ritual traditions that have survived in the shadows of American history. The winter of 1887 marked a turning point in Appalachian history, not just for the brutal cold that claimed dozens of lives, but for what emerged from the desperation it created. When survival becomes impossible through conventional means, people turn to alternatives that civilized society would never consider. In the remote hollows, where the Blackwood influence had quietly spread for over half a century, 5 separate families made choices that would bind their bloodlines to powers far older than European settlement. These weren't random acts of desperation. The Blackwoods had been carefully cultivating relationships with isolated families throughout the region, sharing knowledge through marriages, trade partnerships, and what they called spiritual guidance. By 1887, their network of blood-bound allies had grown to include dozens of households across 7 counties, each family practicing modified versions of the original Shadow Creek rituals while maintaining the appearance of ordinary mountain folk. The expansion began subtly. Martha Blackwood, now in her 70s, but possessing the vitality of a woman half her age, had spent decades identifying families who showed what she called the proper temperament. These were households that already existed on the margins of acceptable society, families who had experienced unexplained phenomena, children born with unusual abilities, or bloodlines that traced back to the earliest mountain settlements where indigenous and European traditions had already begun to merge. The Blackwood method of recruitment was methodical and patient. They would first establish themselves as valuable neighbors, offering aid during difficult times, sharing resources during harsh winters, providing herbal remedies when conventional medicine failed. This created bonds of gratitude and dependence that made families more receptive to deeper spiritual guidance. Only after years of careful relationship building would Martha or one of her descendants begin introducing the philosophical concepts that underpinned their practices. They spoke of the mountain as a living entity that demanded recognition and respect. They explained how the ancient peoples who had lived in these valleys for thousands of years had developed ways of communicating with the forces that dwelt in the deep places, and how European settlers had foolishly dismissed these traditions as superstition. Most importantly, they demonstrated through their own longevity, prosperity, and uncanny abilities that their methods produced tangible results. The recruitment process always culminated in what they called the witnessing. Potential allies would be invited to observe one of the monthly rituals at Shadow Creek, not as participants, but as honored guests who could see the power of the old ways without yet committing to them. These witnessing ceremonies were carefully choreographed to showcase supernatural phenomena that defied rational explanation. Participants would demonstrate abilities that seemed impossible. The stone table would emanate strange energies, and the very air would seem to thicken with presence. Most families who underwent the witnessing left convinced that they had encountered something far beyond their understanding of the natural world. Some fled the region entirely, but those who remained invariably requested instruction in the practices they had observed. This self-selection process ensured that only families with the proper psychological disposition joined the growing network. By the 1880s, the Blackwood Network had evolved into something resembling a secret religious order. Each allied family maintained their own sacred space, usually a natural formation such as a cave, spring, or grove that had been consecrated through ritual. These sites were connected by what the families called the flowing paths, routes through the mountains that followed underground water sources and ley lines of spiritual energy. Members could travel between allied territories using these paths, always finding shelter and support from fellow practitioners. The network operated on principles of mutual aid and shared knowledge. Families specialized in different aspects of the mountain traditions. Some focused on herbalism and healing, others on communication with subterranean entities, still others on weather working or the influence of human minds. This specialization created a complex economy of spiritual services, with families trading knowledge, materials, and ritual assistance according to their needs and abilities. Central to the network's cohesion was the concept of blood debt. When a family received significant aid from another member of the network, they incurred an obligation that could only be repaid through reciprocal service or the participation of their children in inter-family rituals. These blood debts created chains of obligation that bound the families together across generations, ensuring that knowledge and practices would be preserved even if individual households were lost. The most significant expansion occurred during the harsh winter of 1887, when 5 families simultaneously reached crisis points that threatened their survival. Each had been cultivating relationships with the Blackwood Network for years, and each had undergone the witnessing, but none had yet committed to full participation in the deeper mysteries. The severity of their circumstances and the failure of conventional solutions finally pushed them across the threshold. The Mullins family of Copper Ridge faced starvation after their stored food supplies were destroyed in a cabin fire. The Kemp household in Devil's Fork had lost 3 children to a mysterious wasting disease that defied medical treatment. The Ashford clan near Widow's Gap was being systematically driven from their land by a coal company that had corrupted local officials. The Tate family in Bone Hollow was terrorized by phenomena they couldn't explain. Objects moving on their own, voices speaking from empty rooms, and livestock found dead in patterns that suggested ritual killing. The Crowder lineage of Raven's Nest had suffered a series of accidents and misfortunes so precisely targeted that they suspected supernatural persecution. In each case, conventional remedies had failed completely. Local authorities were either unable or unwilling to provide assistance. Religious leaders had offered prayers, but no practical solutions. Medical professionals were baffled by conditions that seemed to defy natural law. It was only when representatives of the Blackwood Network arrived with offers of genuine help that these families finally understood what was being offered to them. The initiation process for these 5 families occurred simultaneously during the winter solstice of 1887, coordinated across the network through methods that demonstrated the sophisticated communication systems the alliance had developed. Each family underwent a modified version of the binding ritual, adapted to their specific circumstances and spiritual needs, while maintaining the essential elements that would connect them to the broader power structure. The Mullins family, facing starvation, participated in a ritual that bound them to the abundance of the deep earth. They were taught to identify and cultivate food sources that grew in places where ordinary plants couldn't survive, mushrooms that flourished in complete darkness, roots that drew sustenance from mineral deposits far below the surface. Their ritual involved the sacrifice of their most precious possession, a family Bible that had been carried from Ireland generations earlier, burned in a fire that produced flames of unusual colors, while family members consumed a meal prepared from ingredients that should not have been edible. The Kemp household, desperate to save their remaining children from the wasting disease, underwent a healing ritual that required them to take the illness into themselves voluntarily. The ceremony involved the entire family lying in a circle around their sick children while consuming a preparation made from plants that grew only in soil enriched by human remains. As the adults absorbed the disease, drawing it out of the children through sheer force of will and supernatural assistance, they experienced visions of the entities that dwelt in the underground chambers beneath their land. The children recovered completely, but each adult family member bore permanent marks of the illness they had taken on, scars and deformities that served as visible reminders of the price they had paid. The Ashford clan, being driven from their ancestral land, participated in a territorial protection ritual that bonded them to the spiritual guardians of their mountain. The ceremony required them to bury personal items from each family member at specific locations throughout their property, while reciting incantations in a language that predated European settlement. The ritual climaxed when the eldest Ashford son allowed himself to be buried alive for a full day and night, sustained by breathing tubes and the supernatural protection of the mountain entities. When he emerged, he possessed a knowledge of hidden resources on the family land that made their property far more valuable than the coal company had realized, shifting the balance of power in their favor. The Tate family, terrorized by supernatural phenomena, underwent a ritual designed to establish communication and cooperation with the entities that were tormenting them. Their ceremony took place in the basement of their cabin, which they excavated to create a chamber deep enough to reach the underground water table. Family members took turns descending into this chamber, which was gradually filled with water until only their heads remained above the surface. In this state of near drowning, they experienced direct communication with the presences that had been disturbing their household. Rather than driving these entities away, the ritual established a covenant of mutual service. The supernatural disturbances ceased, but the family became conduits for otherworldly communications, receiving information and instructions that they were obligated to pass along to other network members. The Crowder lineage, convinced they were being systematically destroyed by supernatural persecution, participated in a protection ritual that required them to identify and confront the source of their misfortunes. Their ceremony involved the construction of a mirror made from polished obsidian, created by melting down family heirlooms, and jewelry in a fire fueled by wood from trees that had been struck by lightning. When family members gazed into this mirror during the dark of the moon, they saw not their own reflections, but images of the entities that had been working against them. The ritual required them to negotiate directly with these hostile forces, offering services and tributes in exchange for the cessation of attacks against their bloodline. Each of these initiation rituals was observed by representatives from other network families, creating witnesses who could verify that the ceremonies had been properly conducted and that the new members had been legitimately inducted into the alliance. These witnesses also served as spiritual anchors, providing stability and support during the dangerous process of establishing contact with supernatural entities. The success of these simultaneous initiations marked a new phase in the network's development. The 5 new families brought resources, knowledge, and territorial coverage that significantly expanded the alliance's capabilities. More importantly, their successful integration demonstrated that the Blackwood methods could be adapted to a wide variety of circumstances and spiritual needs while maintaining their essential effectiveness. The expanded network began operating on a larger scale, coordinating activities across multiple counties and establishing communication systems that allowed for rapid response to threats or opportunities. They developed coded languages for discussing their activities in public, established safe houses for members traveling through hostile territory, and created mutual defense agreements that provided protection against both supernatural and mundane dangers. The network's influence began extending into legitimate institutions as members established themselves in positions of authority. Some became local officials, others opened businesses that served as fronts for network activities. Still others joined religious organizations that they gradually influenced from within. This institutional penetration provided the alliance with early warning of threats, access to resources that would otherwise be unavailable, and the ability to protect their interests through legal and political means. However, the expansion also created new vulnerabilities. The larger the network became, the more difficult it was to maintain secrecy. Coordination between distant families required more complex communication systems that could be intercepted or decoded. The involvement of multiple bloodlines in major rituals created dependencies that could be exploited by enemies who understood the network's structure. Most dangerously, the success of their supernatural practices began attracting attention from entities and forces that viewed the growing alliance as a threat to their own interests. By the 1890s, the network faced challenges that would test both their unity and their supernatural protections. Federal authorities, suspicious of the unusual prosperity and influence that network families seemed to enjoy, began investigating activities in the region. Competing supernatural traditions, including practitioners of African-derived magical systems and Native American spiritual leaders who viewed the Blackwood Alliance as corruptions of sacred traditions, began working actively against the network. Most ominously, the entities that the families had formed pacts with began making demands that pushed the boundaries of what even the most committed practitioners were willing to accept. The winter of 1887 had been a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a story that would ultimately reshape the spiritual landscape of Appalachia for generations to come. The 5 families who joined the network that year would find that salvation came with prices they had never imagined. and that the power they had gained would demand sacrifices that would echo through their bloodlines long after they had passed into the shadowy realm of mountain legend. The true test of their covenant was yet to come, as the network prepared to face challenges that would determine whether their alliance would endure as a hidden force in the mountains, or whether the prices they had agreed to pay would ultimately consume them all. The families who vanished into the mist left behind more than empty cabins and cold hearths. They left behind a network of practices so deeply embedded in the mountain culture that even their disappearance couldn't fully sever the connections they had spent generations forging. What authorities discovered during the investigations of 1957 through 1962 would challenge everything they thought they knew about how far these ritual bloodlines had spread their influence. When federal investigators finally gained access to the sealed records of the Blackwood compound in Shadow Creek Valley, they uncovered something that transformed their understanding of these mountain clans from isolated family traditions to something far more organized and far-reaching. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated documents, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved with meticulous care, were the convergence journals. These leather-bound volumes contained detailed records of inter-family communications, shared rituals, and coordinated activities spanning over 80 years. The journals revealed that what appeared to be separate family traditions were actually components of a larger network. The Blackwoods had maintained regular correspondence with families across 7 states, coordinating their ritual calendars, sharing knowledge of supernatural practices, and most disturbing of all, arranging strategic marriages to strengthen bloodline connections. The winter solstice gatherings weren't just family affairs, but regional conventions where representatives from dozens of affiliated clans would gather to share knowledge and renew their collective pacts. Agent Morrison, the federal investigator who first decoded the journals, wrote in his final report before requesting reassignment that the families operated like cells in a larger organism, each maintaining their specialized knowledge while contributing to a unified purpose he could never fully comprehend. His notes describe ritual sites connected by precise geographic alignments, with families positioned at specific intervals along what the journals called the deep roads, underground waterways and cave systems that formed natural highways between territories. The Holei mining operations, it turned out, weren't just extracting coal. The deep shafts connected to a vast subterranean network that the families had been expanding for generations. Miners who worked the deepest levels, those who survived the monthly tributes, reported that certain tunnels extended far beyond the mapped boundaries of the mine. Some led to natural caverns that showed signs of human habitation dating back centuries. Others connected to abandoned mine workings from different companies, creating a hidden transportation network that stretched across multiple states. More unsettling were the reports of sounds echoing through these deep passages. Workers described hearing conversations in languages they couldn't identify, the movement of large groups of people through distant tunnels, and most disturbing, what sounded like children singing in harmonies that seemed to come from impossible directions. Equipment operators occasionally reported their machinery being adjusted overnight by unseen hands, modified to dig in directions that served no commercial purpose but aligned perfectly with the geometric patterns found in the Convergence journals. The Carver Timber Empire had similarly served purposes beyond profit. Forestry records revealed that their logging operations had created clearings and access roads following specific patterns that weren't economically optimal but formed geometric shapes visible only from aerial photographs. These clearings, when connected on maps, outlined symbols that matched those found carved into the stone tables at various ritual sites. The Carver family had essentially been landscaping the mountain wilderness according to supernatural specifications, creating a massive ritual space that encompassed thousands of square miles. Wildlife biologists studying the region in the 1960s noted unusual animal behavior in areas that had been logged by Carver operations. Deer would move through the forest in unnaturally organized formations, following paths that connected the geometric clearings. Bird migration patterns shifted to incorporate flight paths over these sites. Most mysteriously, predator and prey species were observed gathering together peacefully during certain lunar phases, as if responding to some signal that transcended natural instincts. The Lael Healing Network proved to be perhaps the most extensive of all. Medical records from rural clinics across Appalachia showed patterns that investigators initially attributed to coincidence. Patients with certain rare conditions would travel enormous distances to receive treatment from practitioners who seemed to specialize in their specific ailments. What appeared to be an informal referral system was actually a coordinated network of healers, each family maintaining expertise in different aspects of supernatural medicine. The journals contained detailed correspondence between healing families, sharing knowledge of rare herbs, ritual techniques, and most disturbing methods for transferring ailments between patients. Some entries suggested that the Lael gift wasn't unique to their bloodline, but was being cultivated in other families through careful breeding and ritual practices. Children showing healing potential were sometimes exchanged between families, raised by practitioners who could develop their abilities more effectively than their birth parents. Hospital records from the period show clusters of miraculous recoveries followed by unexplained deaths of young women matching the physical descriptions of known Lel descendants. The pattern suggests that the healing network was recruiting and training practitioners from outside their original bloodlines, expanding their influence by identifying individuals with natural gifts and bringing them into their secretive medical system. The Thornton Energy Empire's transformation from coal to renewable resources wasn't driven by environmental concerns or market forces, but by instructions found in the deepest sections of their sanctuary shafts. Company geologists discovered chambers filled with symbols and diagrams that depicted energy extraction methods decades before the technology existed to implement them. The Thornton family had been receiving technical guidance from their subterranean contacts, positioning themselves to dominate energy markets by staying ahead of technological developments. More disturbing were the reports from workers maintaining the sealed shafts after the company's transition to renewable energy. The chambers that had once been fed with blood offerings now contained sophisticated monitoring equipment that seemed to blend industrial technology with organic components. Maintenance logs described devices that pulsed with their own internal rhythms, screens that displayed information in languages that weren't human, and most unsettling, machinery that appeared to be growing rather than merely functioning. The electrical output from Thornton facilities consistently exceeded theoretical maximums for their equipment. Energy auditors found that their solar panels and wind turbines were somehow channeling power from sources that couldn't be measured or explained. The company's success wasn't just supernatural good fortune, but active collaboration with entities that possess technology beyond human understanding. The Whitaker musical legacy had spread far beyond their mountain compound through methods that investigators struggled to document. Music industry executives described receiving compositions through channels they couldn't remember, sheet music that appeared in their offices without explanation, and melodies that seemed to write themselves. Recording studios reported equipment malfunctions that resulted in improved audio quality rather than technical problems, as if some invisible force were enhancing their capabilities. Musicians across the country began incorporating elements of Whitaker compositions into their own work, often without realizing the source of their inspiration. Jazz clubs in New York, country music venues in Nashville, and classical concert halls in major cities all reported performances that included musical phrases and harmonic progressions identical to those found in the few recordings of Whitaker family performances that survived. The influence spread through what musicologists called harmonic infection. Musicians who heard even fragments of Whitaker compositions found themselves unconsciously incorporating those elements into their own playing. Audiences exposed to these hybrid performances reported the same vivid dreams and emotional experiences described by those who attended original Whitaker concerts. The family's musical gift was propagating itself through the broader musical culture, creating a network of unknowing practitioners who were channeling supernatural influences through their art. Concert venues where Whitaker-influenced music was regularly performed began experiencing unusual phenomena. Instruments would tune themselves overnight. Sound equipment would function perfectly despite obvious defects, and audiences would remain unusually attentive during performances, as if held by some invisible force. Security cameras in these venues occasionally captured images of additional musicians on stage, shadowy figures playing instruments that weren't physically present but whose music could be heard clearly on audio recordings. The most chilling discovery came when investigators attempted to map the full extent of the network using evidence from all 5 families. The geographic distribution of their influences, when plotted on detailed topographical maps, formed a pattern that encompassed most of the Appalachian mountain range. The ritual sites, mining operations, timber clearings, healing centers, and musical venues created a massive geometric design that incorporated natural features like mountain peaks, river valleys, and cave systems. Geologists studying the pattern discovered that it aligned perfectly with the region's underground water systems and geological fault lines. The families hadn't just been practicing isolated rituals, but had been conducting a coordinated operation that treated the entire mountain range as a single massive ritual space. Every mining shaft, every cleared forest, every healing performed, and every song played had been contributing to a supernatural working of unprecedented scale. The evidence suggested that the families had been implementing a long-term plan that spanned multiple generations, gradually transforming the geographic and spiritual landscape of Appalachia according to specifications that originated from sources beyond human knowledge. The entities they had made pacts with weren't just granting individual favors, but were using the families as instruments in a project that encompassed thousands of square miles and affected millions of people who had no idea they were participants in supernatural practices. Weather patterns in the region began changing in ways that meteorologists couldn't explain through natural causes. Storms would form and dissipate following paths that corresponded to the geometric patterns created by family operations. Temperature fluctuations created microclimates that seemed designed to support specific types of plant and animal life. Most unsettling, the changes were accelerating as if the completion of the family's network had triggered some larger transformation that was now proceeding independently. Local residents reported phenomena that suggested the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was becoming increasingly permeable. Animals displayed intelligence and coordination that exceeded their species' normal capabilities. Plants grew in patterns that formed recognizable symbols when viewed from elevated positions. Water sources began exhibiting properties that couldn't be explained by conventional chemistry, with some springs producing water that had healing effects, while others caused hallucinations or temporary changes in physical appearance. The families themselves had become something more than human through their generations of ritual practice. Physical descriptions from the few reliable witnesses who encountered them in their final years described beings that retained human appearance but possessed capabilities that defied natural law. They moved with unnatural grace, displayed strength and endurance beyond human limits, and seemed to communicate telepathically when gathered in groups. Their children, born after decades of supernatural influence, were even more dramatically changed. Reports described infants who never cried, who seemed to understand adult conversation despite their age, and who displayed reflexes and coordination that suggested supernatural enhancement. These children aged differently, reaching physical and mental maturity at accelerated rates while retaining capabilities that normal humans never developed. The network's influence extended into the institutions that governed the region in ways that investigators found both subtle and pervasive. Local political leaders, law enforcement officials, and business executives had been making decisions that seemed rational from their individual perspectives, but collectively served the family's supernatural agenda. Election results, development projects, and resource allocation all followed patterns that supported the geometric design the families had been implementing across the landscape. Federal investigators discovered that their own agencies had been infiltrated by individuals whose family histories connected them to the mountain clans. Though whether these connections were conscious collaborations or unconscious influences remained unclear. Evidence files disappeared, witness testimonies were altered, and investigation priorities were redirected in ways that protected the family's operations while appearing to be routine bureaucratic decisions. The scope of the infiltration suggested that the family's influence had been spreading through professional and social networks for decades, creating a shadow system of governance that operated parallel to official institutions. The Blackwood Network had grown far beyond what even Josiah could have envisioned in those early days beside the ancient stone circle. By the 1890s, their influence stretched across 7 states, woven through bloodlines, business partnerships, and shared ritualistic practices that bound dozens of families in supernatural servitude. What had begun as desperate bargains made by isolated mountain clans had evolved into something resembling a shadow government operating beneath the surface of legitimate Appalachian society. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Each family that entered into communion with the prehistoric entities dwelling beneath the mountains became a node in an expanding network. The Holes with their impossible coal yields, the Carvers with their supernatural timber fortune, the Lels with their pain-absorbing healing abilities, the Thorntons with their prophetic business acumen, the Whitakers with their otherworldly musical gifts. Each clan served as both beneficiary and conduit for powers that seemed to grow stronger with every passing generation. But perhaps most disturbing was how seamlessly these families had begun to integrate their supernatural advantages into the broader economic and social fabric of the region. What outsiders interpreted as Appalachian resilience, ingenuity, or simple good fortune was actually the visible manifestation of an underground economy built on blood, sacrifice, and communion with entities that predated human civilization. The coal industry, in particular, had become a nexus for their activities. Hole mining's success had inspired other families to seek similar arrangements with the things that dwelt in the deep places. By 1895, nearly 60% of Appalachian coal production came from mines that maintained some form of sanctuary shaft, sealed chamber, or ritual site. These weren't mere superstitions or folk practices. They were functional elements of an economic system that operated according to laws that conventional geology and business theory couldn't explain. Mine supervisors learned to schedule their operations around lunar cycles. Company books contained dual ledgers, one for government inspectors and tax collectors, another tracking the true costs of their supernatural partnerships. The monthly tributes, the annual descents, the careful maintenance of bloodline obligations, these became as routine as payroll and equipment maintenance. Workers noticed the patterns, but rarely spoke of them openly. Equipment that should have failed continued operating far beyond its expected lifespan. Dangerous shafts that should have collapsed remained stable for decades. Seams that geological surveys declared exhausted continued producing coal of exceptional quality. And always, the accidents that claimed exactly one life per lunar cycle, as precise as clockwork, as inevitable as the tides. The timber industry had undergone a similar transformation. Carver Timber's expansion had been so successful that competing companies either went out of business or quietly adopted similar practices. The ancient grove, where Ezekiel Carver had made his original bargain, became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though the families who visited it called their journeys business meetings or surveying expeditions. These secondary families, the Mercers, the Kincaids, the Brewers, or the Ashfords, didn't possess the same level of supernatural ability as their predecessors, but they'd learned to cultivate their own relationships with the entities that dwelt in the deepest parts of the forest. Their success rates were lower, their costs higher, but the timber industry's transformation into something that operated according to supernatural rather than purely economic principles was complete. Regional newspapers began reporting on the remarkable prosperity of certain mountain communities. Eager to understand how the isolated areas had managed to thrive while other rural regions struggled. They departed with reports full of speculation about mineral wealth, favorable transportation routes, and exceptional entrepreneurial spirit. None of them stayed long enough to notice the patterns that local residents had learned to take for granted. The way shadows moved independently of their sources in certain buildings. How conversation would cease when strangers approached groups of men discussing business. The fact that children in these prosperous families often displayed unusual abilities, night vision, precognitive dreams, an uncanny ability to locate underground water or mineral deposits. The way dogs and horses would refuse to enter certain areas, even when following familiar trails they'd traveled for years. By 1900, the network had developed its own internal communication system. Messages traveled between families through a combination of conventional methods and supernatural means that defied easy explanation. A businessman in eastern Kentucky would know about a timber contract dispute in western North Carolina before official correspondence could possibly have reached him. Mining accidents in one state would be mysteriously predicted by families in another, allowing them to adjust their own safety protocols or investment strategies accordingly. The healing traditions had undergone perhaps the most dramatic evolution. The Liel family's gift for absorbing the pain and illness of others had inspired similar practices among families throughout the region. By the 1890s, a network of mountain healers operated according to principles that combined traditional herbal medicine with supernatural pain transference techniques. These healers maintained detailed correspondence with each other, sharing not just medical knowledge, but information about the entities they served and the prices they paid for their abilities. Their letters, written in a mixture of conventional English and coded language that disguised supernatural practices as medical terminology, reveal the extent to which the healing network had become integrated with the broader supernatural economy. One particularly revealing letter, discovered in the papers of a deceased healer in 1923, describes a meeting of 12 families held in a remote cave system in eastern Tennessee. The gathering, which took place during the winter solstice of 1899, was apparently convened to address what the participants called the burden sharing protocol. The letter describes how the accumulated spiritual and physical costs of their healing practices were being distributed among multiple families to prevent any individual bloodline from being overwhelmed. The protocol involved a complex ritual where representatives from each healing family would gather around a natural stone formation. They would perform a ceremony that transferred portions of their accumulated suffering to other participants, creating a shared spiritual burden that allowed each family to continue their practices without the rapid aging and early death that had previously characterized their bloodlines. The musical families had developed their own form of networking. The Whitakers' supernatural compositional abilities had attracted the attention of other families with musical traditions throughout the region. By 1895, a loose confederation of mountain musicians had formed, united by their shared connection to supernatural sources of inspiration. These families organized gatherings that they called music festivals, though the performances bore little resemblance to conventional entertainment. Participants described concerts where the music seemed to alter the physical environment, where listeners experienced shared visions, where the boundary between performer and audience dissolved entirely. The festivals served multiple purposes beyond musical expression. They functioned as recruitment events, drawing in talented musicians who could potentially be inducted into supernatural practices. They provided opportunities for families to trade supernatural knowledge and techniques, and they served as rituals in their own right, with the combined musical performances creating effects that individual families couldn't achieve alone. Perhaps most significantly, these gatherings allowed the musical families to experiment with using their abilities for purposes beyond entertainment. They discovered that certain compositions could influence the emotional states of large groups of people. Others could apparently affect weather patterns or wildlife behavior. Some pieces seem to facilitate communication with the entities that dwelt beneath the mountains, creating a form of supernatural telephone system that connected the various family networks across vast distances. The business success of the Thornton coal empire had inspired similar supernatural entrepreneurship throughout the region. Families began seeking out relationships with underground entities that could provide them with prophetic business insights, supernatural protection for their investments, or unusual manufacturing capabilities that gave them competitive advantages. These newer business partnerships operated according to the same basic principles as the original family bargains, but they were more sophisticated in their integration with conventional economic systems. Rather than simply providing raw materials or basic services, these families began developing what could only be described as supernatural industries. A family in eastern Kentucky discovered that certain underground chambers could be used to age whiskey at impossible rates, producing spirits that tasted decades old after only months of storage. Another family learned to cultivate mushrooms in cave systems that produced varieties with psychoactive properties, unlike anything known to conventional mycology. A third family developed a process for treating metals that gave them properties that metallurgists couldn't explain or duplicate. By 1900, these supernatural industries were contributing millions of dollars to the regional economy, though their true nature remained hidden behind conventional business facades. Government inspectors saw successful manufacturing operations, innovative agricultural techniques, and exceptional craftsmanship. They didn't see the ritual chambers, the monthly tributes, or the careful maintenance of relationships with entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The integration of supernatural practices into conventional economic systems created new forms of social organization throughout the region. Traditional Appalachian clan structures evolved to accommodate the needs of families bound together by shared supernatural obligations rather than just blood relationships. Marriage patterns shifted as families sought to create alliances that would strengthen their supernatural capabilities or provide them with access to new forms of otherworldly assistance. Children born into these networks grew up with casual exposure to practices that would have horrified outsiders. They learned to recognize the signs of supernatural influence as naturally as they learned to read weather patterns or identify edible plants. They understood from an early age that their family's prosperity came with obligations that extended beyond conventional social or economic responsibilities. Educational systems within these communities evolved to prepare children for their future roles in maintaining supernatural partnerships. Alongside traditional subjects like reading, writing, and arithmetic, children learned to recognize the geometric patterns that indicated underground entity activity, to interpret the symbolic language that appeared in family correspondence, and to perform the basic rituals that maintained their bloodlines' supernatural obligations. By adolescence, children from these families possessed knowledge and capabilities that set them apart from their peers in conventional communities. They could navigate underground cave systems with supernatural confidence, predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy, and influence the behavior of both domestic animals and wild creatures through techniques that combined traditional mountain wisdom with supernatural enhancement. The network's expansion had also created new forms of conflict and competition. Families with established supernatural partnerships sometimes found themselves in territorial disputes with newer practitioners who sought to establish their own relationships with underground entities. These conflicts rarely erupted into open violence, but they created complex political dynamics that influenced everything from property rights to marriage alliances to business partnerships. Some families attempted to monopolize access to particularly powerful supernatural sites, leading to elaborate negotiations and power-sharing agreements that resembled nothing so much as diplomatic treaties between sovereign nations. Other families formed cooperative arrangements, pooling their supernatural resources to undertake projects that no individual bloodline could accomplish alone. The most ambitious of these cooperative ventures was the construction of what participants called the Deep Road, a tunnel system that connected major supernatural sites across multiple states. The project, which began in secret in 1897 and continued for over a decade, required the coordinated efforts of mining families, timber families, and families with specialized knowledge of underground entity behavior. The Deep Road's construction involved techniques that combined conventional engineering with supernatural enhancements that allowed workers to excavate tunnels through solid rock at impossible speeds. The project also required ongoing negotiations with the underground entities whose territories the tunnels crossed, creating a complex web of supernatural diplomacy that influenced regional politics for generations. When completed, the Deep Road provided the network with a form of supernatural infrastructure that allowed for rapid communication and transportation between distant family territories. Messages could be transmitted through the tunnel system at speeds that defied conventional physics. People could travel between supernatural sites hundreds of miles apart in matters of hours rather than days. Most importantly, the Deep Road created a unified supernatural territory that existed beneath and parallel to the conventional Appalachian region. This underground realm operated according to its own laws and customs, providing the network with a degree of autonomy from conventional government authority that bordered on complete independence. By 1905, the network had effectively created a shadow nation within the United States, a supernatural confederation that maintained the appearance of conventional rural communities while operating according to principles that derived from humanity's oldest and darkest traditions. The entities that dwelt beneath the mountains had found willing partners and families desperate enough to trade their humanity for prosperity, and the result was a transformation of Appalachian society that remained invisible to outside observers, but was total in its scope and permanent in its effects. By the mid-1940s, the Blackwood Confederation had evolved beyond simple family alliances into something resembling a supernatural shadow government operating across 7 states. Their influence had become so pervasive that they no longer needed to hide their activities behind the veneer of normalcy. Instead, they began what historians who dare study them call the Great Consolidation, a systematic campaign to merge their scattered bloodlines into a single, unified power structure that would reshape the very fabric of Appalachian society. The consolidation began with the construction of what they termed the Deep Road, an underground transportation network that connected their major ritual sites across hundreds of miles. Unlike the natural cave systems they had previously utilized, these tunnels were deliberately engineered using knowledge that seemed to transcend conventional construction methods. Workers recruited from outside the region reported that the tunnels appeared to dig themselves, with solid rock face mysteriously opening overnight to reveal perfectly smooth passages that required no structural support, despite extending far deeper than any mine shaft in the region. More unsettling were the reports from these construction crews about the work environment itself. Tools would be found arranged in geometric patterns each morning, despite being scattered randomly the previous evening. Surveying equipment consistently malfunctioned, with compasses spinning wildly and measuring devices providing readings that defied the laws of physics. Most disturbing were the sounds that echoed through the tunnels during night shifts, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within the solid rock itself, as though something enormous was responding to their excavation work with its own mysterious construction project. The few workers who completed their contracts and left the region carried with them stories that would become regional folklore. They spoke of chambers carved from single pieces of stone, their walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. They described underground rivers that flowed uphill, defying gravity as they wound through caverns lit by a phosphorescent glow that emanated from the rock itself. Most memorably, they reported encountering other workers in the tunnels who spoke in archaic dialects and wore clothing styles that hadn't been seen for decades, as though the construction project existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. By 1948, the Deep Road network was complete, though its true extent remained known only to the Blackwood inner circle. Surface investigations revealed ventilation shafts disguised as natural rock formations, emerging from hillsides across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and southern Ohio. These access points were invariably located near sites of historical significance, often corresponding to locations where Native American tribes had once conducted their own ceremonial activities, suggesting that the Blackwood network was built upon far older foundations. The completion of the Deep Road marked the beginning of the most ambitious phase of Blackwood operations, the establishment of what they called the Covenant Territories. Rather than simply influencing existing communities, they began creating entirely new settlements populated exclusively by their extended bloodlines and carefully selected converts. These communities appeared on no official maps and received mail through post office boxes in distant towns, creating an invisible population that existed parallel to conventional society. The first Covenant territory was established in a remote valley system in eastern Kentucky, where 3 generations of strategic land purchases had given the Blackwoods legal ownership of over 40,000 acres of seemingly worthless mountain terrain. Within this territory, they constructed what appeared to be a typical Appalachian community, complete with a general store, a school, and even a small church. However, visitors who managed to locate these settlements reported that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire setup. The architecture itself seemed designed according to principles that had nothing to do with human comfort or conventional building practices. Houses were oriented not toward roads or natural features, but according to underground geological formations that could only be detected through supernatural means. The church was built in a perfect octagon, with windows positioned to align with celestial events that occurred only once every several years. Even the cemetery was arranged in spirals rather than traditional rows, with headstones bearing symbols that resembled no known religious or cultural traditions. More disturbing were the residents themselves. While they appeared to be normal mountain families going about their daily activities, careful observation revealed behavioral patterns that suggested a level of coordination that bordered on the supernatural. Children played games that seemed to involve complex mathematical calculations performed without conscious thought. Adults would pause their conversations simultaneously, as though receiving shared mental communications. Most unsettling, the entire population would sometimes engage in synchronized activities, such as simultaneously stepping out of their homes to observe the sky, despite no apparent stimulus triggering this collective behavior. The Blackwood Covenant territories served multiple purposes within their expanding network. Primarily, they functioned as breeding communities where carefully selected bloodlines could be preserved and enhanced through generations of controlled marriages. Children born within these territories displayed abilities that surpassed even those documented in previous Blackwood generations. They demonstrated precognitive abilities so advanced that they could predict weather patterns months in advance, geological events such as landslides or sinkholes weeks before they occurred, and human behavior with such accuracy that they seemed capable of manipulating the thoughts and actions of outsiders. These enhanced children also served as living conduits for the family's supernatural communications network. Rather than relying on traditional methods of long-distance communication, the Blackwoods discovered that their specially bred offspring could maintain telepathic connections across vast distances, allowing for instantaneous coordination of activities across their entire territory. This communication network proved so effective that law enforcement agencies attempting to investigate Blackwood activities found their plans known and countered before they could be implemented. The establishment of the Covenant territories also allowed the Blackwoods to expand their ritual practices on an unprecedented scale. Rather than conducting ceremonies in hidden caves or remote clearings, they could now perform their most ambitious workings in specially constructed facilities designed to amplify and focus supernatural energies. These ritual complexes, built using the same mysterious construction techniques employed in the Deep Road network, incorporated architectural elements that seemed to function as massive occult instruments. The primary ritual complex, located at the heart of the Kentucky Territory, was described by the few outsiders who glimpsed it as resembling a combination of ancient temple and modern industrial facility. Massive stone structures rose from carefully landscaped grounds, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that created optical illusions when viewed from different angles. Underground chambers connected to the deep road network housed what appeared to be enormous mechanical devices, though their purpose remained unclear to conventional understanding. Within these facilities, the Blackwoods conducted rituals that dwarfed anything documented in their earlier history. Rather than working with individual family members or small groups, they orchestrated ceremonies involving hundreds of participants. Their combined efforts focused on objectives that seemed designed to alter reality on a regional scale. Weather modification became routine, with the Blackwoods demonstrating the ability to redirect storm systems, end droughts through targeted rainfall, and even influence seasonal patterns to extend growing seasons in their territories while shortening them in areas controlled by competitors. More ambitiously, they began conducting what they termed landscape surgery, rituals designed to alter the geological structure of the mountains themselves. Through processes that combined traditional blood magic with techniques that seemed to border on advanced physics, they could redirect underground water sources, alter the mineral composition of soil across vast areas, and even influence the growth patterns of forests to create natural formations that served specific ritual purposes. These landscape modifications served both practical and supernatural functions. By controlling water sources, they could ensure that their territories remained fertile while neighboring regions suffered from mysterious droughts. By altering soil composition, they could make their lands incredibly productive for certain crops while rendering competitor territories barren. Most significantly, by reshaping the natural landscape according to occult principles, they transformed the entire Appalachian region into a massive ritual instrument, with every mountain, valley, and waterway serving as components in a supernatural machine of incomprehensible purpose. The success of these operations attracted attention from sources that the Blackwoods had not anticipated. Government agencies, initially dismissive of reports about supernatural activities in remote mountain regions, began to take notice when satellite imagery revealed landscape changes that couldn't be explained through natural processes or conventional human activity. Geological surveys detected mineral formations that shouldn't exist according to established scientific understanding. Meteorological data showed weather patterns in Blackwood territories that defied regional climate models. More concerning from a national security perspective were reports from military personnel about navigation equipment malfunctions when operating in or near Blackwood territories. Compass readings would suddenly shift, GPS systems would provide impossible coordinates, and radio communications would be interrupted by transmissions in unknown languages. Most troubling were incidents where military aircraft experienced total instrument failure while flying over certain mountain regions, forcing emergency landings and creating security concerns about potential foreign interference. By the early 1950s, a classified federal task force had been established to investigate what government documents referred to as the Appalachian anomaly. This investigation, conducted under strict secrecy protocols, revealed the existence of the Blackwood Network and the scope of their activities. However, attempts to infiltrate their territories or gather intelligence through conventional means proved futile. Agents sent into covenant territories would either return with no memory of their experiences or would fail to return at all, their last known positions corresponding to areas where their radio transmissions had been replaced by static interspersed with sounds that analysis determined were not produced by any known technology. The federal investigation did succeed in documenting some aspects of Blackwood operations through remote observation and analysis of defectors from their network. These sources revealed that the family confederation had evolved into something resembling a supernatural corporation, with different bloodlines specializing in specific aspects of their overall operation. The original Blackwood line maintained control over ritual activities and strategic planning. Allied families managed resource extraction, territorial expansion, and external relations. Newer bloodlines, created through selective breeding programs, served specialized functions such as intelligence gathering, weather manipulation, and what sources described as reality maintenance. This last function proved to be one of the most disturbing aspects of the Blackwood network. Reality maintenance involved ongoing rituals designed to ensure that their activities remained hidden from outside observation and that any evidence of their supernatural capabilities would be dismissed or forgotten by conventional society. Through techniques that combined psychological manipulation with what appeared to be actual alterations to local space-time, they created zones where normal laws of physics were suspended, where human memory could be selectively edited, and where official records would spontaneously change to eliminate evidence of their activities. The effectiveness of these reality maintenance operations became apparent when federal investigators discovered that their own case files were being altered overnight. So photographs would disappear from secured evidence lockers. Audio recordings would be replaced by blank tapes. Most unsettling, investigators would arrive at work to find that case notes they had written the previous day now contained completely different information in their own handwriting, with no memory of making these changes. These discoveries led to the classification of the Blackwood investigation at the highest levels of government security, with access restricted to a small circle of officials who were required to undergo psychological evaluation and memory monitoring to ensure that their recollections remained consistent. Even with these precautions, the investigation proved increasingly difficult to maintain as personnel began reporting shared dreams, unexplained knowledge of events they hadn't witnessed, and growing compulsions to abandon the investigation entirely. The Blackwood Network's influence had grown beyond anything their founders could have imagined. What had begun as a desperate family's bargain with supernatural forces had evolved into a shadow civilization that operated according to its own laws, pursued its own objectives, and possessed capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern society. Their territories had become laboratories for experiments in applied supernatural science. Their bloodlines had become living weapons in a war against conventional reality, and their ultimate goals remained as mysterious as the entities that had first granted them power over a century earlier. As the 1950s progressed, it became clear that the Blackwood Confederation was no longer content to simply exist parallel to mainstream society. Their activities suggested preparation for something far more ambitious, a final phase of their operations that would extend their influence beyond the Appalachian Mountains and into the wider world. The modern age brought new challenges for the ancient bloodlines, as industrialization and federal oversight threatened to expose their centuries-old network. But rather than retreat, the families adapted, evolving their supernatural infrastructure into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. By the 1950s, what had begun as isolated clan practices had crystallized into a shadow civilization operating parallel to mainstream America, complete with its own economy, governance, and reality-altering capabilities. The Deep Road network had expanded exponentially, connecting not just the original Appalachian strongholds, but extending tendrils into major cities across the eastern seaboard. These weren't merely tunnels anymore, but engineered spaces that defied conventional physics. Federal investigators who stumbled upon entrance points reported corridors that stretched impossible distances, chambers where gravity behaved differently, and passages that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The few classified reports that survive describe infrastructure that appeared to be grown rather than built, with walls that pulsed like living tissue and lighting that emanated from sources that couldn't be identified. The families had learned to compartmentalize their operations, creating legitimate businesses that served as fronts while their true work continued in hidden dimensions. Blackwood Industries became a Fortune 500 company. Its board meetings, conducted in boardrooms, where the conference table was carved from a single piece of mountain granite embedded with symbols that predated known writing systems. Corporate decisions weren't made through conventional analysis, but through rituals that consulted the ancient entities beneath the mountains. Stock prices, merger agreements, and expansion plans were all determined by forces that Wall Street analysts couldn't comprehend. Their mining operations had evolved far beyond extracting coal or minerals. The families had discovered that certain geological formations contained what they termed energetic deposits, concentrations of power that had accumulated over millennia. These weren't physical substances, but rather accumulations of what they called the old hunger, the same force that had originally bound them to their otherworldly patrons. Specialized extraction equipment, designed according to blueprints received through their mountain communion rituals, could harvest this energy and store it in containment systems that resembled industrial batteries, but functioned according to principles that violated known physics. The timber empire had transformed into something even more unsettling. The families had learned to cultivate forests that existed partially outside normal space-time, groves where trees grew according to supernatural rather than biological laws. These phantom forests produced lumber with extraordinary properties, a wood that was simultaneously stronger than steel, yet light as balsa, timber that could be carved into shapes that created optical illusions, or furniture that influenced the dreams of those who slept near it. Construction companies across the eastern United States unknowingly incorporated this supernatural lumber into homes, office buildings, and schools, creating a vast network of structures subtly connected to the family's influence. The healing traditions had evolved into a medical empire that operated through both legitimate hospitals and underground clinics. The families had discovered that their ancestral ability to absorb and redirect suffering could be industrialized. Medical facilities in remote areas offered treatments that mainstream medicine couldn't explain, procedures that healed impossible conditions, but at costs that patients never fully understood. Those who received these miraculous cures found themselves subtly changed, their life force partially bound to the family's network. They became unwitting conduits, their dreams monitored, their experiences harvested as a form of psychic taxation that fed the growing supernatural infrastructure. The musical legacy had transformed into an entertainment empire that shaped American culture in ways few suspected. Record labels, radio stations, and eventually television networks fell under the family's influence, not through conventional business practices, but through the hypnotic power of their ancestral music. Songs containing fragments of the original cave melodies were embedded in popular music, creating subliminal effects that influenced listeners' emotions and behaviors. These musical implants served as a form of mass conditioning, preparing the population for the family's eventual emergence from the shadows. By the 1960s, the families had established what they called covenant territories, geographic regions where their influence was so complete that natural laws operated according to their will rather than conventional physics. These areas appeared normal to casual observation, but extended residence revealed their true nature. Gravity might fluctuate according to lunar cycles. Electronic devices would malfunction in patterns that formed meaningful symbols, and residents would experience shared dreams that served as a form of community communication. The families had also developed what they termed the adjustment protocol, a systematic method for altering reality on a localized scale. This wasn't science fiction fantasy, but a practical application of principles they'd learned through centuries of communion with entities that existed outside normal space-time. Small inconsistencies in historical records, the mysterious disappearance of inconvenient documents, the sudden onset of amnesia in potential witnesses, these weren't coincidences, but the result of carefully orchestrated reality modifications. Government agencies occasionally stumbled upon evidence of the family's activities, but their investigations invariably stalled in bureaucratic confusion. Files would be misfiled, witnesses would recant their statements, and entire departments would suddenly receive new priorities that directed their attention elsewhere. The families had learned to manipulate institutional memory itself, ensuring that knowledge of their existence never accumulated beyond a critical threshold. The most disturbing development was their expansion into what they called the breeding programs. The original bloodline restrictions had been abandoned in favor of a more systematic approach to genetic development. They had established a network of fertility clinics, adoption agencies, and genetic counseling services that allowed them to identify and cultivate individuals with the potential for supernatural abilities. These programs operated under the guise of legitimate medical services, but their true purpose was to expand the pool of individuals capable of serving as conduits for the ancient powers. Children identified through these programs were subtly guided toward the family's influence through scholarships, internships, and career opportunities that seemed like fortunate breaks, but were actually carefully orchestrated recruitment efforts. By the time these individuals realized the true nature of their benefactors, they were already too deeply embedded in the system to escape. The families had also developed sophisticated methods for managing their public image, understanding that complete secrecy was no longer possible in the modern age. They cultivated a controlled mythology around themselves, encouraging certain folklore and urban legends while suppressing others. Academic researchers studying Appalachian culture found their work subtly guided toward interpretations that portrayed the families as colorful historical curiosities rather than ongoing supernatural threats. The technology sector provided new opportunities for influence. Early computer networks were designed with hidden protocols that allowed the families to monitor and influence digital communications. The internet, which most people believed was created by government and academic institutions, actually incorporated architectural elements designed by individuals who had been influenced by the family's mathematical principles derived from their communion with non-human intelligences. Financial markets became another vector for their influence. The families had learned to manipulate economic systems through supernatural means, using their reality alteration abilities to influence stock prices, commodity futures, and currency exchanges. Market crashes and economic booms weren't entirely natural phenomena, but often the result of the families adjusting reality to accumulate wealth and power that could be redirected toward their ultimate goals. The space program attracted their attention as they realized that their patron entities weren't confined to terrestrial dimensions. Certain NASA projects included personnel who had been subtly recruited by the families, and some missions carried equipment designed to establish communication with non-human intelligences that existed in the spaces between planets. The public focus on Mars exploration and asteroid mining masked efforts to contact the cosmic extensions of the entities that dwelt beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Environmental movements were infiltrated and redirected to serve the family's purposes. What appeared to be conservation efforts were actually programs to protect specific geographic locations that served as nodes in their supernatural network. Protected wilderness areas weren't preserved for their ecological value, but because they contained portal sites, energy accumulation points, and burial grounds that anchored the family's connection to their otherworldly patrons. The pharmaceutical industry became a vehicle for distributing compounds that prepared the population for the family's influence. Medications that appeared to treat common conditions actually contained trace amounts of substances derived from the family's supernatural practices. These chemical modifications didn't cause obvious effects, but gradually altered brain chemistry in ways that made individuals more susceptible to the family's psychic influence and less likely to notice supernatural phenomena occurring around them. Religious institutions were systematically infiltrated, with the families placing their agents in positions of spiritual authority. Sermons were subtly modified to include concepts that prepared congregations for the eventual revelation of the family's true nature. Prayer groups unknowingly participated in rituals that strengthened the family's supernatural network, believing they were engaging in conventional worship while actually serving as conduits for ancient powers. The educational system became a primary vector for long-term influence. Textbooks were modified to include historical narratives that normalized the family's activities, presenting their past actions as colorful folklore rather than ongoing supernatural manipulation. School curricula were designed to discourage critical thinking about certain topics while encouraging acceptance of authority figures who might be connected to the family's network. By the dawn of the 21st century, the families had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a parallel civilization that existed alongside mainstream society while remaining largely invisible to it. Their influence extended from the deepest caverns beneath the Appalachian Mountains to the highest levels of government and industry, from the smallest rural communities to the largest metropolitan centers. The ancient hunger that had originally driven individual families to make desperate bargains with supernatural entities had evolved into a systematic program for reshaping human civilization according to the will of intelligences that existed beyond conventional reality. What had begun as isolated acts of desperation had become a coordinated effort to prepare the world for a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The families no longer saw themselves as bound by the limitations of mortality or conventional reality. They had become something new, a hybrid form of existence that bridged the gap between human consciousness and the alien intelligences that served as their patrons. Today, these shadow bloodlines continue their ancient work, though their methods have evolved with the changing world. The Covenant territories still exist, hidden within national parks, protected wilderness areas, and private estates that span multiple states. Government satellites mysteriously malfunction over these regions, creating deliberate blind spots in official mapping systems. The families have infiltrated every level of modern infrastructure. Blackwood descendants hold key positions in the National Weather Service, subtly manipulating climate data to mask their atmospheric manipulation. Carver bloodlines control major timber corporations, ensuring certain forests remain untouched while harvesting energy from ancient root networks that span thousands of miles underground. Thornton heirs manage both traditional energy companies and renewable operations, using their supernatural influence to redirect power grids in ways that feed their ritual sites. Their technological integration runs deeper than most imagine. Silicon Valley executives with mountain heritage have embedded supernatural algorithms into social media platforms, harvesting emotional energy from billions of users. Streaming services unknowingly distribute music containing subliminal frequencies developed from Whittaker compositions, slowly conditioning listeners for eventual recruitment. Even GPS systems contain hidden subroutines that redirect travelers away from sensitive areas, or, in rare cases, guide specific individuals toward Covenant territories. The Deep Dwellers have expanded their influence beyond Appalachian caverns. Urban subway systems, basement levels of skyscrapers, and underground data centers now serve as extension points for their realm. Smart city infrastructure unknowingly channels their energy through fiber optic networks that follow ley line patterns established centuries ago. Modern recruitment operates through carefully orchestrated life crises. Families facing financial ruin, individuals suffering unexplained illnesses, or those experiencing supernatural encounters often discover mysterious benefactors offering solutions. These helpers invariably trace back to the ancient bloodlines, perpetuating the cycle of supernatural debt and obligation. The ultimate transformations approaches. Climate change, social unrest, and technological dependence are not random occurrences, but carefully orchestrated preparations for the final merger. When the boundary between worlds dissolves completely, Appalachia will serve as the epicenter for a new reality where supernatural forces openly govern human civilization. The mountains remember every bargain, every sacrifice, every soul claimed across 2 centuries. What began with desperate families seeking survival has become an invisible empire that touches every aspect of modern life. The ancient hunger grows stronger with each passing year, fed by a world that unknowingly serves masters dwelling in the spaces between what is and what should never be.